Oh, hey there. You know what I miss? A good world map. Sometimes called an overworld, not to be confused with a map of the world or even an open world, even though the latter is probably the closest comparison we have nowadays. Confused? Well, let me elaborate. When I think of a world map, the first thing that comes to mind are your classic RPGs from the NES and SNES era, like Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy IV. But what makes these any different than, say, what we had in the original Legend of Zelda? They're all from a top-down perspective, and you can fight enemies on them, so why are these referred to as a world map, whereas this is the overworld? The simple answer is scale. In the original Legend of Zelda, sure, you can walk around a large area outside, and you can find various entrances to caves and dungeons, but the scale of the world isn't nearly as large as something like Dragon Quest. Enemies are visible right there on the map with you, and aside from the trees, for the most part, everything feels like it's the correct size compared to Link. Meanwhile, in Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, the worlds are much larger, and this is shown by each location you find being represented as a set of tiles no larger than your character that, once you interact with, will warp you to a brand new map representing that location. When you fight enemies, it's not immediately on the world map, but instead you're warped into a battle scene, almost as if it's zooming into your location, to show you how the world is supposed to be scaled. For the most part anyway, classic Final Fantasy characters always looked weirdly scaled next to the enemies they're fighting, but still. That's not to say that Zelda never tried to do a world map of its own, because if we look at the sequel, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, that game actually did have a world map, which was home to all of the game's palaces, caves, towns, and various other side-scrolling scenes. Enemy encounters would warp you to a battle scene of sorts to better show the scale of what you were encountering. In fact, Zelda 2's world map is so gigantic that the entirety of the first game's overworld is actually tucked away right here in this tiny section at the bottom. So to simplify things, a world map is just that. It's a map of the world that your characters can traverse on. They were made to show the characters covering long distances without having to show every single set piece in between locations. Similar to how a lot of older movies would show a plane traveling on a map with a red line drawing each location the characters are going to. A lot of older games wanted to be larger or tell stories that were just bigger than they could actually allot for. So things were just simplified down so us, the players, could visualize this world without having to see every single location in it. Over the years though, world maps started to change, both in scale, but also in structure. When I was younger and discovering different RPGs, the way a game represented its world map was a big factor on if I decided if I liked the entire game or not. Now, admittedly, that's a pretty poor way to judge a game, but it does go to show you the impact the world map can have. For instance, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. Say what you will about this game, but for me, when I first played it at a FuncoLand kiosk, I was instantly turned off by how utterly restrictive the world map was, and my dumb little child brain couldn't grasp what was going on. Mystic Quest has a world map, but the player does not have free roam on it. Instead, it's more similar to Super Mario World, where you simply select a level and warp there. Would you call Super Mario World's map a world map? Regardless though, I hated this at the time. I wanted to explore and I couldn't, and to me, that instantly made Final Fantasy Mystic Quest a bad game. I mean, it sort of is, but let's save that for a Java down the road. Mystic Quest wasn't the only game to do this though, as years later, The Legend of Dragoon, which I love by the way, also took this same approach. Now one could argue that this type of a world map and this type of world map are accomplishing the same thing. They show us, the player, the world, while showing us travel between different locations. But the issue I have with this over this is the lack of control and the lack of exploration. Mystic Quest and The Legend of Dragoon are quite literally demanding us to go straight to the next area. There are no detours to be had, no enemies to fight, and the paths are so short you barely even have time to enjoy the world map music. Essentially, you could simply remove the world map from either of these games and it wouldn't make much of a difference. But in games that have proper world maps, you can take your time getting to the next major plot point location. You get a chance to enjoy the scenery a little more, listen to the music. Some games even let you venture further ahead than you're normally allowed to, giving you a chance to fight enemies well above your level, or buy equipment from a town you went to early. And as the games open up more and more, there tends to be different ways of traversing the world map, which can lead to you finding secret locations housing rare items or other secrets. This is what makes world maps so fun. As I said before, the size and structure of world maps would change over time, and eventually the line between a world map and an open world would start to blur. When we talk about open world games, it's usually in reference to things like The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim or The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Even the most recent Pokemon Scarlet and Pokemon Violet are also considered open world games. But are open world games really that different from games with a world map? Well, it depends on who you ask, but for me, it all comes back to scale. As games have become more advanced and worlds have gotten larger, developers and artists alike have shown an increased desire to show the world in its entirety, and thus the idea of an open world became a thing. Why show your character walk a short distance on a map encountering various enemies when you could walk the full distance yourself and see the beauty of the world they've created? It was sort of the natural evolution of the world map. As game development evolved, the number of locations on your typical world map increased. Originally, world maps would connect towns and caves or dungeons. That's it. But over time, developers decided maybe they wanted to show a mountain path that separated two towns. So now, instead of simply walking between some mountains on the world map, it became its own separate set piece that you'd have to traverse through. Instead of simply walking through some trees in the world map, they decided they wanted to show us the characters walking through an actual forest. Games got larger, and more of these types of locations were added, eventually hitting a point where there really wasn't a world map anymore, and they just became open world games. So what makes a good world map? Well, it's entirely subjective. Personally, I like the approach that Dragon Quest VIII took, falling somewhere in that blurred space between open world and world map. The overworld, as it's presented to us, is on a much larger scale than earlier Dragon Quest games. And from the world map, the towns are even scaled correctly for the most part, but it's not quite as large as your typical open world game either, and your movement is still relatively limited. You're not going to be jumping backwards up a mountain to get to a location early. You're still somewhat streamlined on a path like earlier world maps. Once you get the boat, it really does start feeling more like a world map and less like an open world as you see the scale change. I'd love if more RPGs could replicate the feel that Dragon Quest VIII did, but honestly, Dragon Quest XI came pretty damn close. Does an RPG need a world map to be good? No, of course not, but I do think they can be a nice addition. For instance, the classic Pokemon games fall into a weird gray area on what you would call that type of overworld, as the scaling is more similar to, say, like the classic Legend of Zelda, but I do really like how those games were designed and laid out. Sometimes an RPG can be really good, but the world map is rather lacking, such as Chrono Trigger. Because for all intents and purposes, Chrono Trigger's world map is pretty pointless and doesn't even leave much room for exploring, but at the same time, it's hard to imagine the game without it either. Finally, sometimes a game can just be so enjoyable that you might not even realize there isn't a world map until you've been playing for literal hours, such as Final Fantasy X. I adore this game, even though when you boil it down, it's actually extremely linear, but presented in a way that almost tricks you into not realizing it. Personally, I don't think the open world approach should replace world maps, but I do understand how we got here. Sometimes allowing your imagination to fill in the gaps is a lot more satisfying than just being shown everything, which is something I touched on back in my nostalgia effect video. A big issue with the open world style is, again, scale. And I don't mean traversal, I mean that everything just feels smaller. Have you ever noticed how trees in open world games are just pathetically small? Comparing a forest from Breath of the Wild with these little trees that are barely taller than Link to, say, the forest in Twilight Princess, it's easy to see which just looks better. When you enter Black Moon Forest on Xenogears, sure, from the world map, it just looks like some trees. But once inside, and the camera does a sweep showing you how dense and dark the forest truly is, it's just that much more immersive. It's moments like these why I think the set pieces shown in games with world maps are just more enjoyable and immersive than what we get in an open world game. So what are your favorite world maps? Do you prefer the classic style shown in NES, SNES, and PlayStation era of RPGs? Or maybe you prefer maps more similar to Pokemon's design? Do you think open world maps are the natural evolution of world maps? How many more questions do you think I'll ask before I abruptly end the video? Sirens.